The wind carried the scent of freshly baked bread from a nearby bakery as Jack Nolan stepped out of his truck and onto the cracked sidewalk of Cedar Ridge, a struggling neighborhood on the outskirts of town. His worn military jacket clung to his broad shoulders, the faded patches on his sleeve hinting at a past life of duty and sacrifice. But Jack wasn't there to reminisce about his time in service. He was there because people needed help. Across the street stood Cliff Bishop, the local landlord who owned nearly half the rundown buildings in Cedar Ridge. With his slicked-back hair, expensive leather shoes, and smug grin, Cliff stood out like a sore thumb. He strutted down the street, holding a folder stuffed with eviction notices, barking orders at his henchmen as he scanned the area like a predator eyeing prey. Jack watched as Cliff approached a small group of homeless residents gathered near an abandoned storefront. Margaret, a woman in her late 50s, clutched her belongings tightly, her face etched with exhaustion. Beside her sat Eddie, a young man barely out of his teens, wearing a torn hoodie and staring at the ground with hollow eyes. Cliff sneered as he stopped in front of them. "You've overstayed your welcome," he said, waving the eviction papers in the air. "This building isn't a charity. You're trespassing. Time to move." Margaret stood, her hands trembling. "Please, Mr. Bishop, we've got nowhere else to go. We're trying to get back on our feet." Cliff smirked. "Not my problem. Pay your rent or get out." Jack's jaw tightened as he watched the scene unfold. He'd seen men like Cliff before, men who preyed on the vulnerable, using power and fear to get what they wanted. Jack had fought against tyrants in distant lands. He wasn't about to let one take over his own neighborhood. He crossed the street with deliberate steps, his boots thudding heavily against the pavement. His presence alone made people turn their heads. He wasn't just another face in the crowd. He carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had seen battle and survived. Cliff noticed him and raised an eyebrow. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Jack stopped a few feet away, his gaze locked on Cliff. "I think you've helped yourself enough already." Cliff chuckled. "And who are you supposed to be? A hero?" Jack didn't flinch. "I'm someone who doesn't like bullies." Cliff took a step closer, his henchmen hovering behind him. "These people are trespassing. They're breaking the law. I'm well within my rights to kick them out." Jack's gaze didn't waver. There's a difference between enforcing the law and exploiting people who've got nowhere else to go. Cliff sneered. "You going to lecture me on morals, old man?" Jack's lips twitched into a faint smile. "I could. Or I could remind you that I've seen worse men than you, brought down for a lot less." Cliff's arrogance faltered for a moment, but he quickly masked it with bravado. "What are you gonna do? Call the cops? They work for me." Jack took a step closer, his voice low and steady. "I'm not calling the cops, but I am making sure this ends now." Cliff's henchmen shifted uncomfortably, glancing around at the growing crowd of residents who had gathered to watch. The atmosphere was tense, but Jack remained calm, his presence commanding attention. "You've been pushing people around for too long," Jack continued. "These aren't just numbers on a ledger, they're people, and they deserve better." Cliff's face twisted with anger. "You think you can scare me?" Jack leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not trying to scare you. I'm telling you that Cedar Ridge isn't yours to take." For a moment, silence hung in the air. Then Cliff scoffed, tossing the eviction notices to the ground. "This isn't over." Jack watched as Cliff turned and walked away, his henchmen following close behind. The crowd murmured in relief, and Margaret stepped forward, tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. Jack nodded, his gaze still fixed on the street where Cliff had disappeared. This neighborhood isn't just a place to live, it's a place to rebuild, and no one's taking that away from you. As the residents began to disperse, returning to their routines, Jack stood quietly, his hands resting on his cane. The battle wasn't over, but Cedar Ridge had taken its first step toward reclaiming its dignity. And as long as Jack Nolan was around, they would never walk that road alone.